Hi everyone and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering some more of the ghost stories of the haunted mill house in Willington Quay. In the first video I didn't cover very much from the house itself, so I thought I would go into a little more detail. I hope you will find it interesting, though whether you believe the stories or not is an entirely different matter. This might be a slightly long story, but if you are interested in the hauntings at the mill house, I am sure you will find it interesting enough to stick with it until the end. The flour mill and the mill house, as you know if you watched last week's story, were both built in around 1800, and the Unthank family lived there from 1806 until around 1831, with no mention of any ghosts or indeed any problems at all. The issues did not seem to begin until the Proctor family moved in. When Joseph Proctor died in around 1875, his son Edward found a diary he had kept of some of the spooky goings-on at the house. Although this was not a complete account, and Edward claimed that a lot of it was missing, which he had hoped to find, he was never able to find the missing parts, and the diary details he had ended long before the family had moved out of the house, and so there was not a complete history of the hauntings. He claims that he waited several years before publishing the diary details, as his mother had not wanted them published while she was still alive, so it wasn't until around 1892 that they first came to light in print. He was very keen to point out that his father was a very sensible man and well-respected man, and not someone prone to hysteria, and that he felt whatever his father had written about, which was often witnessed by many others, was a true account of what had happened in the house. The first entry in the diary extracts that I have seen suggests that the disturbances had begun around October of 1834, with unexplained noises and footsteps being heard in the house in the room above the nursery. This was a room which was not used, it had no furniture in it, and there is even mention that the door to the room had at one time been nailed shut, which seems a little odd in itself, as no reason is given for this. The first person to notice anything unusual was the nursemaid employed to look after the oldest child, who was around 2 years old at the time. She had kept this to herself for some time, so it was not until early 1835 that the family became aware of the problem. She claimed that she would hear noises and footsteps in the room above almost every night, and that at times the footsteps were so heavy that the window in the nursery would rattle. She was clearly very upset by this, and had at times called the kitchen maid to the room to see if she also heard the same sounds, and it seems that she did not hear them. However, the diary goes on to state that within a few days of the nursemaid telling her tale, almost everyone in the house had heard the sounds and the window rattle in the nursery, and that no one could explain them. Joseph's wife had asked for the room to be swept out, though it's hard to understand why, as no one was using it, and on spending some time in the nursery, this was what she thought she could hear in the room upstairs, only to find that none of her staff were in that room at the time. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the nursemaid who first reported the sounds had now left and been replaced. In advertising the job, the family had concealed the fact that the house may well be haunted, which I can totally understand, as I doubt you'd get anyone applying for the job if they knew about that. The second nursemaid at first did not hear anything, but that very quickly changed, and she had asked who was in the room above the nursery, to be told that no one was. How long she remained in the house I do not know, but there is no mention of her leaving. Sometimes the sounds above were described as being as if someone had very heavy boots on, but this it seems was quite rare, and it was usually more just dull thuds. Often someone would enter the room as soon as the noises had been heard, but it was always empty, with nothing to be seen. Joseph's brother John had spent a long time one day in the nursery in the hope of hearing something, but nothing happened. But as soon as he left, it was apparently so loud that the nursemaid, absolutely terrified, ran downstairs with the child in her charge half asleep in her arms. Joseph does spend some time trying to figure out what might be making the noises. He finds the house and the windows to be soundly built and that there is nothing inside, such as a mouse or a rat. Though I'm not quite sure a mouse or a rat would sound like footsteps in the room below. He cannot find any connection with the weather, such as strong winds or vibrations from the close-by flour mill, but the noises are still heard at all hours during the day, though mostly in the early evening. The disturbances from around February of 1835 seem to change. Joseph and his wife believe they hear someone knocking on wood somewhere close to their bed, and Joseph also feels that when leaning into the cradle of his child, something tapped on the leg of the cradle and he felt it vibrate. It is also around this time that the noises are no longer confined to the room above the nursery, as things are now experienced in other areas too. Now I have to admit that the noises were bad enough, but feeling vibrations and hearing noises next to my bed would have had me moved out in less than 10 minutes, but the Proctors are made of much sterner stuff. It's also around this time that Thomas Mann, the foreman of the flour mill, is said to have heard at around 1 a.m. one night the creaking of the carts in the yard of the mill. The carts are said to have a sound like no other, so he felt sure this is what he had heard. But on checking them, he found none had moved, and although he searched the yard, he could find nothing around to attribute it to the sound. And he also claimed to have heard on a few occasions footsteps in the gravel outside near the house when no one was around. Sometime later, Joseph Proctor spoke with his cousin George Unthank, and he is said to have told him that the house, and more especially the room where the noises had first been heard, was indeed haunted. However, no one in his family, that's George Unthank, had ever heard anything. It is also said that the mother-in-law of the previous owner, Mr. Oxon, had died in the house, and it's possible that Joseph was suggesting that she was the cause of the haunting. But his diary entry about this is unfinished and unclear, and when he spoke of this some years later to his son Edward, it seems he felt it was just hearsay and unfounded. It's at this point that I will try to condense the stories down a little, otherwise this will be a very long story, and most of the sights, noises and other spooky goings on are very similar to each other. A lady in one of the mill houses claims one night to have seen the form of a woman in one of the windows, described as being white and transparent. This same figure was seen later by Mr. Proctor's sister and Mrs. Mann, though this time it's described as looking more like a priest than a woman. This was seen at the same time by Mr. Mann and his daughter. It was said that the sight slowly faded away from view over a period of around 10 minutes. In 1892, when Joseph's diary was first discussed, Mrs. Proctor's sister, who was still alive at the time, confirmed this story to be just as she remembered it. Jane Carr, another relative, was disturbed when staying at the house by footsteps on the stairs, the sound of someone winding a clock, footsteps in the room above hers, and by her bed being shaken. Mrs. Proctor and a lady known as Nurse Pollard both felt their beds being lifted up and down several times one night. Neither lady spoke to each other about it until the morning, when they both told the exact same tale. Both Mr. and Mrs. Proctor, often when in different rooms to each other, heard the same sounds of footsteps above them and the sound of doors opening and closing. In the nursery, 2 of the elder children and 2 nursemaids heard the sound of a loud rattle, which seemed to come from the closet in the room. All were terrified, apart from the elder boy, who told his sister not to fear, as God would take care of her. The elder boy himself had heard many things: footsteps in the room above his bedroom, footsteps outside of his room, and once feeling that someone had stepped very close to his bed and that his bed had been shaken. Other things often heard were whistling and a strange whizzing sound. Edward Proctor said in 1892 that his father had once or twice mimicked this sound in later years, and to him it had sounded horrible. There were also sounds of furniture being moved, people either walking or running, and even once Nurse Pollard felt something pressed down upon her arm. Shrieks were sometimes heard, or what sounded like loud groans. No room in the house was untouched. There had been sounds heard in the kitchen. The cook one time slept upstairs to keep the maids company, and what was assumed to be her setting to work early in the morning, opening the door and opening the kitchen window, turned out not to be, as she was still upstairs and had not been into the kitchen at all. John Carr, Mrs. Proctor's brother, spent only one night in the house. He was so disturbed by the bumps, footsteps, whistling, and other odd noises that he refused ever to come back, and said there was no way he could live in such a house. Jane Carr, Mrs. Proctor's sister, and Mary Young, a cook, spent one night sleeping in the same room. Both felt someone come into the room and head towards the bed. It was a four-poster bed with drawn curtains. Mary saw a shadow by the curtain, but Jane did not, as she had hidden herself under the covers. They later found the door to the room still locked and no sign that anyone had been inside. The young child, Jane, claimed to have seen what appeared to be the head of an old woman at the bottom of her bed, but she too hid under the covers and saw no more that night. She did, however, claim to see the same head on the stairs just a few days later and was terrified of it. Often the sound of the handbell would be heard in rooms above when no one was there, and the young boy Joseph claims to have heard voices which say things like, "Come and get," and "never mind." Somewhat strange things for a voice to be saying. It seems that for a short time at the end of 1840 things calmed down, and it was hoped that whatever had been the problem was now over. But by May of 1841 things were happening again. Some of the children heard their names being called and what sounded like the rustling of a lady's dress when no one was in the room. Perhaps one of the strangest tales from the return of the sights and sounds has to be from the young child Joseph, who claimed that a monkey in the nursery had pulled his shoe. It seems the other children had seen something too, as they were searching for it when their father arrived to see what was going on, but it was only seen once and never again. Figures were often seen in the house, sometimes a pale-faced woman and other times a man. The man was even said to enter rooms and open and close windows. These figures were more often than not seen by the children of the house. Sometimes the noises had been so bad that it was felt someone truly was inside the house. Mr. Proctor and some of the servants had gone downstairs one night to look and found nothing wrong. On heading back upstairs, they then heard the sounds coming from above them, and it was said that it was so bad that the servants refused to go upstairs to sleep. The diary extract I have seen ended some several years before the family moved out of the house, but Edward Proctor claimed that nothing changed in the years between the diary ending and the family moving. Perhaps not as frequent, but sights and sounds were seen constantly. The family finally decided to move out in 1847, moving to North Shields. Some reports do say they moved to Benton, but I believe North Shields is the right location. The final night in the house was spent by just Mr. and Mrs. Proctor, the rest of the family having moved on to their new home and the servants having gone also. Edward describes it as being one of the worst nights ever, with constant footsteps, banging and crashing, voices, whistling and many other noises all night long. It was, he said, a most miserable night spent by his parents. It has been noted in some reports that the strange things still happened at the Proctor's new home, but Edward claims that this is not true and that once they moved all was fine. If you watched last week's video, you will know that I discussed what happened to the house after the Proctors left. But just as a quick recap to finish this story, the Mann and Elliot families shared the home for 20 years until the mill closed in 1867. They had little or no experiences of anything strange in their time there. The house was later made into tenements, and apparently none of the tenants had had any issues whilst living there. Edward Proctor had even actually spoken to some of the tenants to ask them if they had seen or heard anything, and every person that he spoke to said they had not. So it truly does seem that the ghosts left when the Proctor family left, And as said in last week's video, the house was demolished many years ago, so unless the car park is haunted, there is now little or nothing to see other than some small signs of where the garden once was. There were never any stories suggesting that the mill itself was haunted. It was always focused on the mill house. I have to admit to not reading the book The Haunting of Willington Mill, whose title is a little deceiving as it is about the mill house, not the mill, but having read the extracts from the diary of Joseph Proctor, I find the stories are quite hard to disbelieve. So many people hearing the same sounds at the same time with no knowledge that others are hearing them at the same time as they are. So many experiencing bed movements or seeing figures at the same time as each other, again with no knowledge that others can see them or hear these things at the same time. All seems very odd to me. But what do you think? Was the mill house truly haunted? And if it was it more than one ghost? I will leave it up to you to decide. I do hope that you have found this slightly more detailed story of the mill house and the ghostly goings on interesting. And I thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again very soon.